Here's something that very few people understand about the news media's coverage of Israel. News organizations have rules in place that require anti-Israel bias. Now, you might hear that and think, what? No way. What's this guy talking about? But what you'll hear ahead is that I'm about facts first, always. And these rules factually exist. There are these rules only for coverage of Israel. And the net result of these rules is to portray Israel as being totally different from the rest of the world and some sort of uniquely evil entity, which it isn't. So this is not just a story of how the media handles Israel. This is a story of media failure in general. Now, there are a lot of rules in place that I'll talk you through, but today, on this first episode of They Stand Corrected, we need to start with this one.
Israel's security agency, the people in charge of dealing with Palestinians in the occupied territories, turns out
Israel, and they too are rejoining their families in the occupied territories. And
annexing settlement blocks in the occupied territories, mainly
not
in the
on
West.
the occupied territories.
This is how news outlets have referred to these two little blocks of land for decades. The occupied territories. This is ridiculous and completely nonsensical. Ahead, I'm going to explain why this framing makes absolutely no sense and is a failure to provide truth. Truth is two things: facts plus context. And when you hear these two little blocks of land referred to as the occupied territories, you're not getting either. The whole framing makes everything about the coverage of that little part of the world skewed. But the media never explained this, so ahead, I'm going to. And to do that, I'm going to take you on a quick little tour of the world, and I'll tell you about a Palestinian government document that says the Israeli occupation ended 3 decades ago, and I'll explain why Islamist terrorist groups are actually pro-occupation. Yes, really. All that ahead on They Stand Corrected. All right, let's get going. For those of you who don't know, my name is Josh Lebs. I spent 20 years inside mainstream media, and I did a lot of fact-checking on air and online, and a lot of explaining complicated news stories. And then I wrote a book and now run my own businesses and write a lot of columns and get interviewed on the media a lot. I can't stand seeing the media fail. We need sources of truth. And there are so many ways in which the media are not doing a good enough job of getting you the truth. I'm starting with this issue because the October 7th attacks in Israel by Hamas, these unimaginably evil terrorist attacks, and the war ever since between Israel and Hamas has shown me the incredibly dire effects of ignorance and how the media is fueling that ignorance, which should never be the case. News media should be trustworthy sources of truth, always. Here's something I've learned. When it comes to talking about Israel and that part of the world, unfortunately, people have so many preconceptions and false ideas and emotions tied up with it that it can be really hard to lay out facts clearly. What I found is that it helps to use a different example of the same principle that we're about to talk about. Trust me here, you'll see exactly why this leads back to occupation, all right? Imagine this. Let's say a group of stereotypical racist people, like anti-Black racist people. Imagine that they're standing on a street somewhere, and they look across the street, and they see a small group of Black Americans, and they think that this group is selling marijuana. This group of racist people starts talking about this group of Black people as the criminals. They say, hey, those guys are criminals. And they start telling everyone that those guys are criminals. And they start contacting the media and saying, how come no one's doing anything about the criminals? And pretty soon, the term catches on. And everyone is referring to this one little group of people of color as the criminals. And then you get government agencies and candidates weighing in on the criminals. And everyone soon has decided that this little group of people are the criminals. Now, never mind that there are horrific, violent criminals all over the country, all over the world, doing way, way worse things. This group of racist people has managed to get the words the criminals associated with this one little group of people that they saw on a street corner. And soon, when people hear the words the criminals, they just imagine that one little group. And then it gets even worse. What if it turns out that that's not even what that group of Black people were doing in the first place? So not only are they being called the criminals, but it's not even necessarily clear that they are criminals. When you hear this example, you can tell how racist it is, how ridiculous it is, how bigoted it is. This is what you're hearing when the media has said this for decades.
Nice settlements in the West Bank actually started this way, and in fact, several similar outposts in other parts of the occupied territories were legalized.
Israel Security Agency, the people in charge of dealing with Palestinians in the occupied territories, turns out they're
Israel, and they too are rejoining their families in the occupied territories and
annexing settlement blocks in the occupied territories, mainly
is not
in the
on
West.
the occupied territories.
This is insane in both of the ways that I was just talking about. First, there are occupied territories all over the world, tons of them. And second of all, it's not even clear that that term accurately applies to these two places that the media has nevertheless been branding the occupied territories. This is how ridiculous it is. This is how biased it is. But the media are so used to it that they don't even think about it. They just continue doing this. I know it's a complicated issue. This is why a lot of really well-intentioned people just don't know any of these things. And I saw this happen inside news agencies, where people who were even higher ups had no idea what occupation even is or where it's going on in the world. Let's just take a look at a few basic facts. These areas that we're talking about go by two names. There's the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank was part of Jordan and Gaza was part of Egypt when they were among the nations that launched a war against Israel in 1967. Israel managed to win against all odds, and as part of winning this defensive war, ended up gaining control of those areas. And this is crucial. Jordan and Egypt don't want those lands back. And Israel soon began negotiations to create the first ever Palestinian state with those lands. Just very basic thing to know here. In the 1990s, Israel handed over control of much of the West Bank to Palestinian leaders. And in 2005, Israel went and pulled out all its people from Gaza, even physically removed Jewish residents by force. When people think of occupation, this generally is not what they imagine. There was the occupation of Germany after World War II, which was crucial and helped to change Germany for the much better and end Nazism. Occupations like that are about military controlling an entire area in most people's minds, and this foreign entity having control of the entire government there. When people hear that Gaza and the West Bank are occupied, this has always been the kind of thing that most people imagine. Palestinian leaders have continued to say that both of these areas are occupied. But here's something that very few people realize. There was a document that the Palestinian government submitted last year to part of the United Nations about the city of Jericho, which is in the West Bank. And in that, they listed the end of the Israeli occupation period for Jericho as having been in 1994. I know this is confusing, but all you need to understand is this. The world and the media talk about these entire areas as being occupied, when even according to that Palestinian document, they're not. And the way people imagine what occupation is, they're not. Is it even accurate to call the West Bank and Gaza occupied? Well, unfortunately, there's no clear answer to that. As I've looked into this, I have seen that different agencies, different governments use these terms any which way they want. The terms are used in such different ways that the meaning of occupation isn't even clear in general. But here's what is certain. All over the world, there are areas that are occupied in the ways that you probably imagine occupation to be. So calling these two little blocks of land the occupied territories is ridiculous and speaks to that form of bias I was telling you about earlier with the criminals. Which areas of the world are occupied? That's after the break. All right, and we're back. By the way, I really like upbeat, happy music, so that's what the breaks are going to have. Because why not? It's my podcast. There is a map of the world that you've probably never seen. It's mostly red, and it shows disputed territories all over the world, including those that are under military occupations. It uses Wikipedia's list of military occupations, which is pretty long. And that list has everything from the nation of Georgia to northern Cyprus to the majority of Western Sahara. And that list also says the United States is currently occupying this area in Syria called Al-Tanf, which has been in the news lately because the U.S. military has an outpost there that's been involved in conflict. Now, you may know Wikipedia has these editors who are volunteers and spend a lot of time going through this stuff. They take their work really seriously. But even if you don't go by Wikipedia, you can go by the CIA World Factbook, which is a common reference in journalism, and you see lots of occupations listed all over the world. Here are just a few of the nations that are currently listed as occupying land. They include China, South Korea, Sudan, and Iran. Now, Iran, that might be particularly interesting since Iran is always happy to claim that it stands against occupation when it comes to Israel. By the way, Iran is occupying lands. Now, as I said earlier, different places use the term occupied differently. National Geographic has a website for kids, educating them, and this one says that Guam is currently occupied by the United States. I'm recording this episode in early 2024, and the National Geographic website says it was just updated in October 2023. So this is current, them saying that Guam is occupied. That doesn't mean that that's what the government of Guam says. This is just a sign of how this term gets thrown around in so many different ways. And the list goes on, and you obviously don't need to worry about any of the specific places that I just mentioned. The point is there are lands all over the world that are occupied in the way that people generally imagine occupied. And yet, when you hear the term the occupied territories, you are led to think of just these two tiny little stretches of land that you can blame Israel for, and in reality, those lands might not even meet that definition of occupied. And this is the kind of bias that a lot of people, including me, are trying to help people understand. This unique way of presenting only Israel as some sort of evil thing. It's ridiculous. And I'll tell you a quick story here. One day, a producer, when I was at CNN, a producer brought up in a show meeting, how come we never talk about any other occupations going on around the world? And the head of the show said, what other occupations are there aside from Israel? Incredible. And that's especially incredible because at the time, the United States was occupying both Afghanistan and Iraq. It's time to talk about that. Now, you might not have heard the term occupation used all that often in coverage of those two areas, but these were indeed occupations. Here's Senator Russ Feingold talking in Congress in 2007.
It will end because of our continued occupation of Iraq is making conditions worse.
And then 15 years later, here's Senator Chris Murphy in 2022. He was talking about the devastation that came to Afghanistan when the U.S. occupation ended.
Once the U.S. military occupation and all the foreign aid that came with it disappeared, the Afghan economy predictably collapsed. 75%.
Now think back. In all the years that the United States was occupying Afghanistan and Iraq, did you ever once hear any journalist, any news agency ever say that they were reporting from occupied territory, from U.S. occupied Afghanistan, from U.S. occupied Iraq, literally once ever? So just think about the hypocrisy of this. U.S. news agencies had people during those years reporting from Gaza and the West Bank, calling those occupied, while also having people in Afghanistan and Iraq not calling those occupied territories, even though they were. This is what I'm talking about. These are structured in ways that are designed to make Israel look as bad as possible. And here's the result that this kind of bad reporting has. This is a survey that came out recently that news organizations probably do not want you to see. Here's what it showed. The majority of Americans age 44 and younger thought that Israel has been ruling Gaza. Now, it hasn't, but can you really blame them for thinking that when all this time the media have been calling it occupied territory? Recently, there has been one other part of the world in which the media have begun to use the term occupied territories sometimes, but Instead of that being a solution, it actually just shows how deep this problem runs. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the media have sometimes referred to areas in Ukraine that Russia has seized as being occupied territories. Here are some examples.
Top stories. Moscow prepares a ceremony to mark the annexation of occupied territories in Ukraine.
Putin is now on the eve of a major speech. He's now expected to formally annex 4 of those occupied territories in Ukraine.
The move is an effort to try to block Ukraine's offensive, which has reportedly reclaimed thousands of miles of occupied territory.
But that just shows this problem, because what it does is it draws a ridiculous comparison in people's minds, since they're used to only hearing the occupied territories as referring to the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky has repeatedly said that Israel and Ukraine are similar, that he associates Ukraine with Israel because both are sovereign nations that were attacked by a ruthless enemy. So when you hear occupied territories only used for Israel and then Russia, you can actually get the opposite idea from what he has been saying. Now, no matter what, you still don't hear occupied territories all over the world as being referred to as occupied territories. Now, I mentioned earlier that all of this is about rules, that this is structured. When reporters refer to areas around the world, they're generally following guidelines established by their news agencies that say, this is how you refer to those areas. There's this system inside news agencies, generally referred to as standards and practices, that show you what you're supposed to say and not say. It is the standards and practices of all these news agencies to not refer to all these occupied lands around the world as being occupied, but to refer to the West Bank and Gaza as being occupied, even if they aren't. Now, some news agency leaders like to say, well, the government uses that term, so that's what we're doing. But since when do the media take their cues from the government about what to say and not say? Isn't that supposed to be the exact opposite of what the media do? And this flaw in the system that the media follow has really devastating effects. First of all, it does plant this idea in people's minds that Israel is some sort of uniquely evil entity, which, as I said earlier, is ridiculous. It also helps Islamist terrorist groups because they get away all the time with claiming that they are anti-occupation, and people fall for it. And there are so many problems with that because it's not even accurate. First, these groups consider the entire existence of Israel to be an occupation. So they're not even talking about what the media calls the occupied territories. But also, this is something that the media never point out. These Islamist terrorist groups are pro-occupation. They want to reestablish an Arab Islamic empire. The Arab Islamic empire was built through colonization, force, enslavement, occupation, and all of these other things that people are supposed to be against. These groups are working to reestablish one. You know, in America, the idea of empire seems like old news. Who's going to be an empire to try to take over the whole world? These groups, as a rule, support that. That's what they're working toward. That's what they want. And not only that, but what you hear about often is Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon. Hezbollah also actively supports Syria reoccupying Lebanon. I know that this is confusing. Don't worry about the specifics of it. The point is, Hezbollah is pro-occupation, not just in the sense of creating a new empire, but also of Syria coming back in and occupying Lebanon again, as it once did, in a really brutal way for decades. All of these nuances, all of this big picture reality is lost when the media says the occupied territories. This is really simple. People should be able to get truth from the news media. And as I've said, truth requires two things: facts plus context. Both of those are lost when the media refer to the West Bank and Gaza as the occupied territories. All right, what can you do about it? That after this. It's up to us to hold the media accountable. So how can we do that? Well, I have links for you. If you click on the show notes or you just go to my website, joshlebs.com, you'll see I have a rundown for each episode of this show that's filled with links and text that you can use to send to news agencies when you see these problems in action. If you see or hear a news agency talking about the occupied territories, contact them and ask the top executives, why do you call these areas occupied, but not all the following areas occupied? They won't have an answer, and it will force them to realize that they have a problem. There's also something much faster you can do, which is send me links. Send me the stories that you see or hear on any platform, and I can get in touch with these places. Part of the secret of They Stand Corrected is that I actually hear from people inside news agencies all the time that want to make a positive change, but they feel helpless and they don't feel anyone on the inside will listen to them. They're often excited when I come along and tell executives, hello, you have this problem. I'm sure you want to fix it. So here's how you can do that. Anyway, you'll see all this information available to you at my website and linked in the show notes. Also, send me your questions and your comments. I look forward to sharing some of them here. I will answer some of your questions. There's also a way that you can leave me a voice message, and I'll play some of those here and respond to them. And if you know any facts that you think I need to take a look at, or you think I got something wrong, tell me. I plan to do segments called I Stand Corrected, because it's so important for everyone to show that it's good to learn new things, and that if you get something wrong, you correct it. That's how this works. Coming up in the next episode, why news agencies refuse to use the word terrorist when it comes to groups that kill Israelis, but they're willing to use that same term in other places all over the world. It's crazy, it's wrong, and it's hypocritical. You'll learn all about that in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. It's amazing to have you with us. You can support this show and tell sponsors about it. All that information is available in the show notes and at my website. Until then,